Welcome back. You're still tuned in to Salam Media, and this is our roving broadcast of the war against Iran, initiated by the United States of America and Israel. And last night, early this morning, the world came to the brink, essentially, and then at the very last minute, stepped back. Donald Trump has announced a 2-week ceasefire with Iran just hours before a deadline he set for possible military strikes. And this follows days of escalating threats with the United States and Israel ramping up pressure and raising fears of a wider regional war. The ceasefire is quite fragile for now. It's conditional and comes amid continued tensions on the ground. So why did Trump step back, and what happens next? That's what we're going to be finding out. And we'll be speaking to Professor Takahashi, who's going to be giving us insight on that, who's going to be giving us analysis on this new turn of events. And if the ceasefire is indeed a moment where we can say the beginning of the ending of the war has been initiated, is joining us via our virtual platform. Prof, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views. Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
And I think we'll jump right into it. What was for you the key moment that you probably thought Donald Trump would step back from some of the threats that he has made? And what's your general analysis of the last few hours and what the world has witnessed?
Yeah, sure. Look, first of all, Donald Trump is a professional con man. And it wouldn't surprise me if he'd already decided that he was going to step back. He was going to blink already a few days ago, maybe even, almost as long ago as a week ago. And that he had just been sort of ramping up the old rhetoric just to sort of make it look like he had intimidated and frightened the Iranians into coming to the negotiating table. That wouldn't surprise me. Now, okay, so why did he blink, like you say? I mean, why did he step back from the brink? There's been a lot of analysis and a lot of commentary about the midterm elections in the United States. I personally don't buy that at all. I think, he and the group of fascists that he surrounds himself with, they don't care about elections. They have no intention whatsoever of, abiding by elections that they don't like and that they don't win. So I don't really buy that. In fact, I think it's something much more, I don't know if I call it sinister, but it's something about his own, about his finances. Look, Donald Trump really doesn't care about the United States. This has been a strategic catastrophe for the United States. There's no question. But he doesn't care about that. I mean, he cares about himself, his money, and his ego. That's all he cares about. Now, there have been reports coming out recently that the Gulf nations, they had been making, outlandish pledges of investment and huge sums of money being moved to U.S.-based investments and U.S. Corporate data centers that were going to be built in the Gulf, and just a lot of money that was being given to Kushner and his very dodgy looking investment fund and all that. And there have been reports coming out recently over the past few days that there's a lot of rethinking of that. And the Gulf nations are starting to say, look, we just don't have the money for this anymore. We're just not going to do this anymore. And, if I were to place my bets on one factor, on one thing, I would say that would probably be it. Every mafia movie that, we've all seen, you open a restaurant and the gangsters come and they say, you're going to pay protection money. And, that's basically what the relationship has been. That's, the Gulf nations have been paying through the nose, outrageous sums of money, billions and billions of dollars for protection money from the United States. And it's transpired over the past 2 years or so that, this is just not as advertised. Qatar was attacked directly by the Israelis. Trump and the Israelis launched this war without, against what the Gulf nations had been asking them to do. They didn't even bother to tell them, it seems. And, it's really the Gulf nations that have been paying the biggest price. So, I think that's really part of it. The other thing is, of course, the ego. And, Donald Trump is, I think, realized at a relatively early stage that he had been conned into this. When you live by the sword, you die by the sword. I said he's a professional con man, and that is what he is. But so is Netanyahu. And Netanyahu seems to have done him one better. He basically conned him into doing this. And Trump realized that, hey, this is not as easy as I had been told. This was completely different from what had been sold to me. So he doesn't like looking bad. Again, I don't think it's about the elections. I don't think he makes those kind of connections. But I think it's, he looks bad. He looks like a loser. And then he scrambles around asking he doesn't ask anything of anybody. He demands that, the Europeans and the Japanese patrol the Strait of Hormuz for him because he's messed everything up beyond recognition. They sort of, laugh at him and say, forget that. And then he looks bad. And I think that's really, that's really also part of it. So I think it's basically his pocketbook and his ego that has driven him to this.
Very, very concerning indeed. I want to look at things from Iran's point of view now. How do you think they would be feeling right now, the conversations that they'll be having? We saw that 10-point plan that they presented. And the conversation around Iran and the United States when it comes to this war was always about the objective and how Iran's objective was easy. It was self-preservation. They had to survive. And from the United States point of view, you couldn't really get an idea of what victory was, what it looked like, and what was the reason they even entered this war initially. From Iran's point of view, would you say this is a victory? They self-preserved. They could get out of this with a bit of what they want, if not maybe the ego of Donald Trump and the ego of Benjamin Netanyahu, which both are really bruised right now. I just saw the headlines. Netanyahu, one of the politicians of the opposition party, said he's a loser. He's a loser and he should be impeached. What do you make of Iran right now and how they've carried themselves throughout this period?
Well, Iran throughout this war on them, this blatantly illegal war against them, they've carried themselves. They've survived, and that's really all they had to do. And that's basically what I mean when I say it's a strategic catastrophe for the United States. Similar to Hamas throughout the overt genocide that Israel inflicted on them and continues to try to inflict on them in Gaza, all they had to do is survive. They didn't have to destroy Israel or, bring down the state of Israel. They just had to survive. And it was the same with Iran. They just had to survive. There was no question of them, beating the US military or anything like that, but they just had to survive. And lo and behold, they have. They've really won this with flying colors. We have to see what's going to happen over the next weeks. I kind of doubt that there will really be any kind of serious agreement over the next 2 weeks. So I think it'll probably be extended a little bit. And, I really hope that things don't go sour again. But so we have to see what happens. But so far, they are in a much, much better position than they were at the beginning of this illegal war. And they're in a much better position than they were when Trump walked out of the nuclear deal in his first administration. Really, I keep saying this, but it has been a strategic catastrophe for the U.S. I mean, they have basically bombed Iran, and they've painted themselves into a corner. They painted themselves. They pushed themselves into a much, much weaker position than they ever were, and it's really just. It is. Again, I keep on saying this, it was an illegal war. There was no legal justification for this whatsoever. It was an outrage that this even happened. But it's also shocking to see just how incompetent these people are. I shouldn't be surprised, of course, but, you'd think that there was some sort of semblance of strategic thinking or something in people at that level, but lo and behold, these people, they have no idea what they were doing, completely out of their depth. And this is what happens. Again, we have to see what happens in the next 2 weeks. I really hope that it does not go sour. But Iran's in a pretty darn good position. This 10-point plan, of course, has it has a lot of demands that I'm sure the U.S. will push back on. and Iran probably doesn't think it's really going to get it anyway. But that's the
Mm,
whole. That's the art of the deal. I hate to use that terminology, but that is the art of the deal. And they can give way on some things, but get away with with a lot more than they might have got before. The big question, I think, in my mind, is Israel. And
mm,
yes, not Netanyahu has an ego too, but Netanyahu is just a much more clever scheming animal than the likes of Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump you can see coming from a mile away, but
mm,
Netanyahu is a survivor. And I hate to sort of say anything. I'm not saying anything good about him, because he's a fugitive from international justice. He is, I dream of seeing him in an orange jumpsuit. But I think he's a little bit more strategic than that. And what I fear, and I think what everybody fears, is that Israel is going to try to spoil this.
mm,
They have been doing this, and this is the thing. When I get back to what I said before, that Trump realizes that he was conned into this, he was tricked into this by Netanyahu. At certain stages of this of these attacks, it came to light that there were people that the U.S. were trying to negotiate with, or maybe hoped that they could negotiate with, and Israel just went ahead and killed them.
mm,
And you might remember that some journalists, there was something happening at the White House, and they asked Trump about this and said, "Well, what are you going to do about this?" And Trump looked very deflated. And you could tell, you can tell a lot from this guy's facial expressions. And he looked deflated. He looked, he was incoherent in his response, saying, "Oh yeah, I mean, it was barely even English. Yeah, Bibi and I, we do independent, but I spoke, and he won't do that anymore." But you could tell he was deflated, because he
mm,
realized he looked like a loser. He looked like a chump. And he does not like looking like a chump. This guy doesn't like that. So I think that's also part of it. His ego is really behind this. But what the Israelis are going to do, this is the big question. They've already said that Lebanon is not included, which is
yes.
completely different from what the Iranians are saying. We have to see what's going to happen. But this is going to be the big factor, and it could be, this could be a game changer in many ways. It could go south, it could go the wrong way, but it could also go the right way. I mean, again, Donald Trump does not like being made to look like a chump and a fool. And
Mm,
if he thinks Bibi and the Israelis are doing that, he's going to abandon them. The
mm,
Gulf money is, numerous zeros bigger than anything that the Zionist lobby in the US can muster. So if it's a choice between those two, and I'm not saying it's necessarily that kind of either or choice, but if it's a question between those two, then he's going to go with the Gulf any day. And the Zionist lobby, he couldn't care less about. So we just have to see. That's my main worry, how the Israelis are going to try to spoil this.
And I think that's the worry and concern of everyone at this current moment. I think one thing that was interesting for me was an emergence of third-party countries, particularly Pakistan, in coming out in being a negotiator, mediator, and preventing an escalation. What did you make of their role, and does it signal almost a shift in global dynamics when we see a country like Pakistan, who traditionally you wouldn't expect to be a mediator and a negotiator in such a large scale tension driven war, and they've emerged, and they look like they've passed with flying colors. What did you make of their involvement?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's been really impressive how the Pakistanis have stepped up and managed to get this through. Again, we have to see what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks. But certainly to have brought it already to this stage, is something. And then kudos to the Pakistani government for having done this. I mean, it's very impressive. But like you mentioned, it's also indicative of a certain shift, and we have to see what happens. already over the past weeks, we've seen Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and also Saudi Arabia sort of get together and start forming a bloc.
Mm,
How that's going to develop and where that's going to go, we have to see. There's been a lot of talk about a fallout between the Saudis and the UAE. I don't have any kind of internal information or anything about that, but we a lot of things are happening now, and the U.S. blundering into this, the bull in the china shop, and just breaking everything and coming out with nothing in return. This is really going to cause some very significant shifts. Whether it's going to happen tomorrow or whether it's going to happen in a very dramatic, overt fashion is something I'm not really sure of. But certainly it's going to happen, because a lot of
mm,
countries that have relied on Pax Americana, that have relied on protection money given to the U.S. in exchange for security, they're realizing this is just it's not as advertised. The U.S. will protect Israel. The U.S. will do anything for Israel. But if it comes, when it comes to the rest of us, well, they're just not there for us. So, this is going to be a big shift. There were also reports of, I'm sure you've read those reports too, of the interceptor missiles.
yes.
Very quickly the Gulf nations were running out, because they're having missiles every day. I was in Abu Dhabi at the time, and quite a few times every day you would hear these explosions overhead. So these were the interceptor systems coming into play, but they were running out, and there were reports of them asking the Americans to replenish these
Mm,
pronto, because they were running out. And the reports were saying that the Americans were like, oh no, we have to, the Israelis get priority, and then if anything's left, maybe we'll give them to you. And this is not what the Gulf nations signed on for. This is billions and billions of protection money that they have been giving. We
mm,
remember the 747 that the Qataris gave,
yes.
to try. I mean, this kind of blatant transactional stuff going on. But if they're not getting what they bargained for, well, they're going to be rethinking this. These are very strategic countries. The Gulf nations. Each one of them has their own national interests, but I'm talking of them sort of as a collective. But these are very strategic countries, and they have an eye on their long-term interests, and their long-term interests. If the U.S. is not going to be there for them in the mid to long term, they're going to be distancing themselves. There are going to be a lot of changes, I think, going on.
And I think we're all looking forward to that, how the Gulf nations almost respond to the United States of America now, considering what has happened, how America reacted when they were attacked. Could this signal a wake up call, perhaps? And I think this is going to be one of the top stories coming out in the next few days. But we're going to be here for now. Professor Saul Takahashi coming to us from Osaka. Really appreciate you giving us your time, and I hope we chat again soon.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
There you go. International human rights and a humanitarian lawyer, Professor Saul Takahashi, coming to us live from Osaka, Japan. And yeah, there you have it. A pause in fighting, but no clear resolution. And I think the countdown may have stopped, but the crisis is far from over. And if the countdown has stopped, well, another one has begun, because I think we're all waiting with bated breath to see what's going to be happening after that 2 week pause, that 2 week ceasefire, and what's going to be happening in between, in the 2 weeks leading up to the end of that deadline. Gulf countries, for instance, I think it's going to be interesting to see they how they react to this, because it was very, very unprecedented. I think the expectation was the United States of America, let them have bases in your countries, let them invest as much money as you can, be in close proximity and in good books with Donald Trump, and hopefully you'll be protected. You'll be number one when it comes to those that are shielded should anything like this would have happened. And it didn't pan out that way. And you could tell as it was ongoing weeks and days into this war that a lot of them felt that it was a big mistake. They felt like they were essentially used as human shields and as cannon fodder for Israel and the United States of America. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting days ahead. But we're going to continue to be giving you all the latest regarding this war, give you sharp analysis. We'll continue to be getting guests from all across the world to give you their perspective on this, because the world has become so smaller now. It doesn't matter what happens where, ultimately it will reach your doorstep. We're here at the tip of the African continent in South Africa, and we are feeling the effects of the war in Iran by the United States of Israel. So it's very, very important that all of us remain on the pulse regarding what's happening all across the world, and with this war in particular being of key focus because of its economic and diplomatic implications. Otherwise, we've come to the end of today's edition of News and Views. Continue to follow us for more updates on the world in and around you, with the key focus right now obviously being the US-Israeli war on Iran. Otherwise, from myself, Salailo Makwidiri, and everyone here at Salam Media, it's bye for now. Shap shap.